Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here. And thank you very much to QUART and to Corolla for inviting me to open this conference. I'm going to talk about evidence-based interventions, and at the end of the talk I'm going to focus more on professional credentialing for those who ought to be running the kinds of interventions that I'm talking about. One thing one can say about interventions for individuals with autism is that there's a lot of controversy about what the research evidence actually tells us. And, but having said that, nearly everyone, governments, local authorities, service providers and so on, agree that good practice, best practice, should be based on the available evidence. And everyone also agrees that the earlier the intervention, the better. So there we have some common ground. However, there are considerable differences of opinion in terms of what the research and the current evidence base actually tells us in terms of those things. Here are some quotes I picked out from a couple of policy documents, sort of best practice guidelines for working with individuals with autism. Educational provision for children with autism should be inclusive of a range of methods and approaches. That's a very kind of common statement that you see in policy documents. And another very similar one, educational provision for children with autism should involve the adoption of a range of strategies. These are quotes pulled out directly from policy documents. And I often hear people say at conferences, people that work within kind of mainstream academia, working within the field of autism, that there is no unequivocal evidence for any one approach being any more effective than any other. And I hear that often. And I hope one of the things I would like to do within this talk is to demonstrate why I think that is not the case. And anything I say that's contentious, I'm happy for you to come up and talk to me in the break about. So, in my humble opinion, the research actually does strongly suggest several things, actually. That there is good evidence for the efficacy of behavioural intervention in the context of autism education. And I'm going to call that behavioural intervention for autism, or BIA. And furthermore, that there is more evidence to support the efficacy of that, behavioural intervention for autism, than there is for any other approach. So that's a very different conclusion to the one I showed you on the previous slide. So the question is, why is there this discrepancy between these two quite distinct conclusions about the research evidence? Here are some typical justifications that support the kinds of recommendations for practice that you see in some of the documents, the snippets of which I showed you earlier. One commonly used argument is that there are very few randomized controlled trials supporting behavioural intervention for autism. Now that's true. Another justification is there is genuinely insufficient research evidence available to draw any conclusions. Now I would argue that that's not true. And another often used argument is that not all, and I've underlined that quite deliberately, children that have behavioural intervention with autism make progress. Now that's also partly true, but I will show some data that suggests that actually many children with autism make progress. Now, randomised control trials. Undoubtedly they are viewed as the gold standard in terms of scientific research. But I think it's unlikely there are ever going to be sufficient numbers of randomised control trials to satisfy academics, policymakers, in terms of evaluations of autism interventions. And that's for a number of reasons. First, any and all interventions for children with autism ought to be highly individualised according to the assessed needs and deficits of the children they work with. That said, individualised interventions do not lend themselves to randomised control trials because they're all completely different. It would be impossible to control, I think, for families adhering to strict protocols for a period of time in order to assess whether one particular type of intervention is effective versus another. And the types of things we might be asking families to rigidly adhere to are things like no extra speech and language therapy, no OT, no diets, no other types of interventions, nothing for 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. And I think that's quite an impractical thing to ask and probably quite an impossible thing to ask. And if you think about it, there are a staggering number of different variables involved for any intervention. The age of the child at the start of the intervention, the intensity of the intervention, the training and experience of those delivering the intervention, just to name a few. So whereas randomized controlled trials are fantastic for evaluating new drugs, I think they're fantastically unsuitable for evaluating autism interventions. And in any case, there are other research designs that we can use when we look at evidence. So let's look at some of this research evidence. And I hope that many of you will be familiar with some of the studies that I'm going to talk about. I've just taken a selection of what I see as key studies that are contributing to the evidence base for behavioural intervention for autism. Now, the first of these is the Lovas study that was published in 1987. Lovas and colleagues provided early intensive behavioural intervention for an average of 40 hours a week, 50 weeks of the year for a minimum of 2 years. So absolutely an intensive intervention. And that was provided for children between the age of 3.5 and 4.5 at the start. So early intensive intervention. And what Lovas and colleagues described at the end of that period was that 9 of the 19 children in their experimental group, so nearly 50%, made such significant gains that Lovas used terms like recovery. And they used 3 different criteria to assess the progress, the significant progress of these children. And those were that these children now had IQ and adaptive behaviour within the normal range, whereas they didn't before. They were able to be supported in mainstream schools. They were able to be integrated into mainstream schools without support. And possibly the most important, they were otherwise indistinguishable from their typically developing peers. So they were the data that Lovas and colleagues published, and compared that with the comparison group that they had, and only 1 of 39 children obtained a similar outcome. And those children were followed up 6 years later, and those results were published in a study in 1993 that showed that 8 of those 9 children were had still maintained those gains. And one conference somewhere, I can't remember where, we were shown a video that involved 2 children, 14, 15 years old, in the school playground talking about girlfriends. And the challenge to the audience was which one of these 2 children was one of the ones in the original Lovas cohort. And it was impossible to tell. The audience were kind of 50-50. It was a random kind of guessing game. Okay, here's another study. 2002, Tristan Smith published some research evidence from the Lovas multi-site project. So after Lovas published his results, there are a number of different replication sites were set up around the world, and Tris Smith was responsible for coordinating those. And looking at all of the children from those studies, they reported mean IQ gains of 20, similar gains on language and adaptive behaviour, and much less restrictive school placements. Okay, so more recently, 2005, Jane Howard and colleagues published a paper. They gave 29 children what they called intensive behaviour analytic treatment, and they contrasted those with 16 children who received what they described as intensive eclectic treatment, autism education programming. And they also had another group of 16 children that received non-intensive eclectic treatment, and they called that the generic educational programming group. And all of these children received 14 months of access to these different treatments. And here is some data that I pulled straight out of the Howard paper. What you see on the left-hand side, the IBT group, the intensive behaviour analytic treatment group, is the intake data for receptive language learning, is clustered on the left-hand side. And after the intervention, you can see the spread of scores. And compared to the other two groups, you can see how that spread of scores is quite significantly higher than the other groups. And here are similar data for expressive language learning. Now, one of the things these data tell us is that there were some children that didn't make progress, and I'll come back to that. In the same year, also, Glenn Sallows and Tammy Graupner published a study where they had 24 children randomly assigned to either a clinic-directed group or a parent-directed group, both groups receiving what they described as early intensive behavioural intervention. And again, here are the data I've pulled straight out of their paper. Data points on the left are the starting point, baseline data. Data points on the far right are the follow-up data after 4 years. And again, what you can see is that nearly half of the children have made quite significant, astounding progress, actually, and the other half have not. Okay, this is a study published in the UK in 2007, Bob Remington et al., the SCAMP project. SCAMP is the Southampton Children's Autism Project. And they had 23 children receiving intensive behavioural intervention, and they contrasted that with 21 children who they described as having treatment as usual. And what that amounted to was whatever autism provision the local authorities were offering at that time to children living in that area. And they provided early intensive behavioural intervention for 2 years and followed the other children for 2 years. And these are what their data look like, again pulled straight from their paper. What you see is on the left-hand side the early intensive behavioural intervention data. The data are represented as change scores. So the line at 0 represents no change. Children who fall to the left of the line show some regression. Children to the right of the line show some improvement. And what you can see from these data is, relative to the comparison group, the children who received the intensive early intervention, more of them made progress. And there's a black arrow drawn down through around 27 IQ points, which I will explain in a second. But what I wanted to draw your attention to at this point was where those arrows fall on either side. 6 of the children in the intensive early intervention group made significant progress. I made changes of over 27. No children made such significant losses. In the other group, 3 children made such gains, but also 3 children made such losses. So a distinct difference between the two, albeit not as marked a difference as with some of the other studies. Okay, this is a paper published by a colleague of mine, Sigmund Eldevik, 2009. And what Sigmund and colleagues did is they conducted a meta-analysis of all the studies they could find that used behavioural intervention for autism, actually specifically early intensive behavioural intervention. And the studies had to meet certain protocols to be included in the meta-analysis. There had to be a group design, there had to be at least one other group, a comparison group or a control group, and the study had to report either IQ or adaptive behaviour or both. And they found 9 studies that met those criteria. And this is an explanation for those arrows you saw in the Remington et al. Graph. They used a statistic called the Reliable Change Index. And that's a formula that computes the amount of change that shows the effects not due to measurement error. And essentially what it tells you is, at this point, we can be fairly certain that these changes are highly significant and not due to any other variation or measurement error. And for the sake of computing this reliable change index, they worked out that children had to make gains of at least 27.4 IQ points to be described as meeting this index, the reliable change index. So they had to make 27.4 IQ point gains or 20.9 adaptive behaviour point gains. And that sounds like a phenomenal amount. So the question is, how many children could possibly have made that many that much progress? And the answer was a fair number. Actually, 27.1 of the samples they looked at made IQ gains of that much. And nearly 20% made adaptive behaviour gains of that much. Now, I think that's a staggeringly significant result. When they compared that with the control groups, only 10% of the kids in the control group made IQ gains of that level of significance, and 7% for adaptive behaviour. And for comparison groups, significantly less. So clearly, behavioural intervention for autism doesn't work for all. And this is an analogy I like to use. It's up to you which picture you prefer. I know which one I prefer. It's the glass half full, glass half empty kind of conundrum analogy. Now, what I find strange is, going back to one of my first slides, the recommendations made often by local authorities, governments, organisations and so on is that one should use a range of treatments and approaches. But the evidence doesn't stack up for many, if any, other treatments and approaches. And so it seems strange to me that, given that we do have some evidence that significant numbers of children make progress using behavioural intervention for autism, not everyone, but significant numbers, why can we then not go on to say, well, we should make that as a recommendation? So it seems that because not all children make progress, no recommendation is made, rather than some recommendation. And I find that very strange. And that's not a criteria that I see applied to any other intervention. I don't see data for other interventions saying, oh, well, because we don't have a significant result, or because we don't have many children making progress, we're not going to recommend that. Actually, these things do get recommended. And they often get recommended as a kind of eclectic package. Okay, this was a project that was published in 2009. It went on for several years before that, actually many years longer than it probably should have done. It was commissioned by the National Autism Centre in the US. And it was a project that was designed to look at and evaluate all the research evidence for interventions for autism across the board, in order to produce a set of standards that set out effective research evaluated education and intervention for children with autism, and therefore guidelines for that. And the project comprised a large panel of international experts, including renowned scientists, practitioners, researchers and clinicians, hundreds of them across the world. So this project was designed to eventually become a single authoritative source of guidance for families, practitioners, policymakers, funders and so on, to help them make informed decisions and choose effective interventions, of course. So what the National Standards Project did is it looked at all the peer-reviewed treatment literature targeting individuals with autism younger than 22 years of age. That was the cut-off that they agreed on. And the research had to address core features associated with autism rather than kind of family issues or other issues. And from the 3,500 or so studies that they found, after they'd applied their exclusion criteria, they were left with 775 specific research studies that met those criteria. And of those 775 studies, 38 separate treatments were identified. And what the project then went on to do is they designed a way of evaluating those studies against specific criteria. So they designed a scientific merit rating scale where they looked at experimental rigour of the research, and that included group designs and single case studies, not just randomised controlled trials. They looked at the quality of the dependent variable in these studies. They looked at evidence of treatment fidelity, demonstration of participant ascertainment, and whether generalisation data were collected and reported. And those figures afterwards, the 0.3, 0.25 and so on, that's the weighting for those. So the experimental rigour of the research was weighted highest. So having looked at a study, they would then give it a figure based on that weighting, so a number. And then they also rated each study in terms of treatment effects. So each study was given a label of either as beneficial, ineffective, adverse or unknown. And the combination of both of those led to what they called the strength of evidence classification system. So how good was the research design is one issue. You can have a fantastically tight research design but not very interesting results. Did the treatment work? You could have the other way around. You could have a not so tightly controlled study but fantastically significant results. But if you had both, then the study got quite a very high weighting. And this is what the, how the strength of evidence classification was defined in terms of those different categories. So if the treatment was decided to be, that was described as an established treatment, then there was sufficient evidence to sufficient evidence is available to confidently determine that a treatment produces favourable outcomes for individuals with autism. That is, these treatments are established as effective. That's a very definitive statement. And then these other categories, which I won't read out. You can have a look for yourself. So what I'm going to show you now is I'm going to show you the treatments, and I don't like the word treatment, but this is the word they use, the treatments that they identified as being in the category of established. And they are these, 11. Antecedent, I appreciate some of these have some quite strange names. Antecedent package, behavioural package, comprehensive behavioural treatment for young children, joint attention intervention, modelling, naturalistic teaching strategies, peer training package, pivotal response treatment, schedules, self-management and story-based intervention package. Now, of those 11, I have put an asterisk by 10 of them. And the reason I've done that is because reading the definitions of those, the description of those packages within the final report suggests that they are quintessentially behavioural intervention packages. So 10 of the 11 treatments that they identified as established were behavioural intervention treatments. And on the basis of those data and the existing research data, some of which I've talked to you about, there are recommendations for behavioural intervention for autism as opposed to other treatments and approaches from all these people. And there's some quite powerful names on this list. Surgeon General of the USA, New York State Department of Health, Supreme Court of British Columbia, and so on. More than half of the states now in the US reimburse behavioural intervention for autism through the health insurance system. So that's how strongly the recommendation is taken in the States. The Chief Scientific Officer of Autism Speaks, Geraldine Dawson, said publicly in response to a question about research funding, the question was, why do you spend 95% of your research funding on looking at etiology of autism rather than intervention? And she said publicly, that's because I think there is unequivocal evidence for the effectiveness of behavioural interventions. And hence we have recommendations from all these people. But what is a behavioural intervention for autism? Well, contemporary behavioural intervention for autism is a combination of many research-validated methods that combined into a comprehensive but highly individualised, and I've underlined all the key bits here, programme for each child to teach skills or address problem behaviours. Okay, I appreciate that's quite general, but it highlights the individual nature of these interventions. Each learner is helped to develop skills that will enable him or her to live as independent a life as possible. Again, learner-specific. Skills to be taught and problem behaviours to be ameliorated are determined through initial detailed assessment, and the skills and indeed the teaching components for these interventions are very clearly defined and specified in observable terms and measured, carefully measured on an ongoing basis. Skills are listed in all the main domain areas, okay? Communication, social, self-care, physical, play and leisure, and so on. And skills are broken down into smaller component skills and sequenced developmentally from simple to complex. Now, I haven't yet mentioned applied behaviour analysis. Here's the connection. Behavioural intervention for autism is an intervention, treatment, educational provision based on the principles, processes, concepts and so on, and uses the methodology of applied behaviour analysis. So, ABA is not a treatment for children with autism. ABA is the use of behaviour analytic methods and research findings to change socially important behaviours in meaningful ways. So ABA is actually an applied natural science. I showed this slide at a conference in Romania once, and I had a number of people come up to me in the break and assure me that the slide was wrong, and I assured them that it was not wrong. ABA is not, and that's why I've underlined not, a teaching method or methods. It's not specifically related to treatments or interventions for autism, and it's not characterised by one-to-one instruction, intensity of intervention or early intervention. A very common misperception, I think, is that that is quintessentially what ABA is, and actually it's quintessentially what it is not. Here are just a few other applications of applied behaviour analysis. General teaching, classroom management, organisational behaviour management, sports training, treating addiction, increasing driver safety, treating dementia, marriage counselling, and I've put behavioural intervention for autism at the bottom of that list, but the list is almost endless. Behaviour analysis can be applied to pretty much anything you would like to apply it to. So how do we know when we see an intervention whether it's a behavioural intervention or not? How do we know that it's a good behavioural intervention? Well, I would suggest by this method. I think that both the definition of a behavioural intervention and the quality of the provision is absolutely and only determined by the skills and competencies of those responsible for delivering it. And skills and competencies are developed through advanced academic training, not a couple of workshops. I met someone the other day, it was an autism residential service, and I was introduced to him as the behavioural specialist. And I said, what's your training? And he'd been to 3 weekend workshops, and that was it. I don't think that's good enough. Extensive hands-on experience, including supervisory experience, of teaching individuals with autism using the principles and methods of the science of behaviour analysis. And those skills and competencies are evidenced through a worldwide credentialing system that we now have, which I'm going to talk to you about. So the BACB, the Behaviour Analyst Certification Board, is the only recognised worldwide credential we have. Sorry, organisation for credentialing that we have. The BACB is an independent non-profit corporation. It's not a membership organisation. It was founded in May 1988, so we're 13 years old now. It's endorsed by, but independent from, the other main behaviour analysis organisations, the Association for Behaviour Analysis International, Division 25 of the American Psychological Association, that's the Behaviour Analysis Division, the European Association, the Association of Professional Behaviour Analysts. A lot of time and effort has gone into ensuring the quality of the credentialing process, and credentials are accredited by the National Council for Certifying Agencies, and that's part of the Institute for Credentialing Excellence. And the BACB credentials practitioners at 2 main levels. The first and the higher level is Board Certified Behaviour Analyst, BCBA. And the eligibility criteria for that are a master's degree or higher, 225 postgraduate coursework hours in behaviour analysis, and 1,500 hours of supervised experience. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about all of this, but if that's something perhaps you can, if you'd like, you can come and talk to me about in the break. Those are the eligibility criteria. Once one becomes eligible, you have to sit and pass the BCBA exam. It's a 4-hour multiple choice exam. There's also credentialing at a slightly lower level, the Board Certified Assistant Behaviour Analyst, BCABA, and the eligibility criteria for that is minimum of bachelor's degree, 135 undergraduate coursework hours, and 1,000 hours of supervised experience. And then, of course, sitting and passing the BCABA exam. So we're not talking about a couple of workshops here. Okay, let's show you some data. These are the cumulative number of BACB certificates worldwide now. Actually, these data are slightly out of date. The last examination administration took place in September, and I know that we now have over 10,000 certificates worldwide, but the data have not been properly processed yet. you can see from the graph on the far right-hand side that the number of BCBAs, which is the darker green, now exceed the number of BCABAs. Now let's contrast that with the number of non-US, because the graph before was everyone. This is everyone outside the US. And this represents something like 1/15 of the total number of certificates worldwide. So we've got a lot of catching up to do. So there are nearly 600 of us. And again, let's contrast that with the number in Europe. So that's slightly more than a third again. So again, lots of work to do in terms of catch up. But again, the data show a similar pattern, more BCBAs than BCABAs. Here are where these people currently reside. And I've highlighted the UK and Ireland for us locally, and you can see that we, outside Canada, which I still count as North America, forgive me, that we represent the highest number of certificates probably anywhere else. Okay, 78 in England, 17 in Northern Ireland, and I'm sure some of you in the audience. Okay, here are the number of BACB course sequences. So to do the coursework means attending a BACB-approved course sequence. There are now 194 universities worldwide, and of those 194 universities, there are 303 separate courses. 37 of the universities are outside the US, but there are also 40 distance learning courses. So just because you can't find a course locally doesn't mean that you don't have access to the training. There are a number of really good distance learning courses. And there are significantly more courses designed to deliver the coursework for BCBA certification than BCABA. And here are where those course sequences currently reside outside the US. And I've rather shamelessly highlighted the ones I'm directly involved with, so you can see how busy I am. But, you know, small numbers. Again, apart from Canada and Ireland, you know, 1 or 2 here and there around the world. Now, these are really interesting data. What these show is where those courses are actually located in terms of academic departments. And 10 years ago, 5 years ago even, the majority would have resided within departments of psychology. Now the majority reside within departments of education. At least they do in the US. But this is a growing trend, it seems. So the most courses are within departments of education, followed then by psychology, and then a mix and match of others. I'm not sure that really matters, but it's interesting, I think. Okay, just very briefly then. The examination to become a BCBA or BCABA is built on the content of the BACB task list. And that task list is generated through quite a complex job task analysis that involves a group of subject matter expert panels meeting every 5 to 10 years and agreeing on the knowledge, skills and abilities that ought to be necessary, known by and exhibited by behaviour analysts. And the field then of behaviour analysts are surveyed on the importance of those tasks. So a really important point to make is that it is the field that determines the content, not the BACB. I think many people think that the BACB determine what the competencies should be. They don't. It's the field. And just to set the coursework requirements into perspective, it says new requirements and old requirements. Actually, the old requirements are the current requirements. The new requirements come into effect from next year. But what you can see, just very quickly looking at this, is that this is not something that can easily be achieved by going on a couple of weekend courses. This is a tough academic training. And the requirement is moving from 225 coursework hours to 270 coursework hours. So anyone wishing to do it, if you start now, you can probably make it under the old requirements still, just. Okay, and then same for BCABA. Again, moving from 135 necessary undergraduate coursework hours to 180 from next year, at least starting from next year. Okay, just a summary then. Behavioural interventions for autism. have overwhelming empirical and international support. And you don't have to take my word for it, you can have a look at the literature. Behavioural intervention for autism is one of many applications of applied behaviour analysis. Applied behaviour analysis is a natural applied science, not just another therapy or approach. All ABA provision services, including that provided in the context of autism education, behavioural intervention for autism, can and should only be delivered by those who are properly trained in the science. Thank you very much.